Hi again. We're reading through Ernest Sandeen's essay in the book, The Rise of Adventism. His essay in chapter 7 of that book is about millennialism. During the 18th century, apocalyptic millenarianism waned considerably. Not until the French Revolution did the movement revive. That political cataclysm broke with such force upon Europeans and Americans that no image but an apocalyptic one seemed to give adequate expression to the drama and panoramic sweep of those events. Thrones toppled, continents were conquered, worldly expectations were reversed. A dynasty that had existed for 1,000 years was ended in a few months. When Napoleon temporarily dethroned the Pope himself in 1798, wheels began turning in the heads of biblical scholars. In the Roots of Fundamentalism, the dethroning of the Pope in 1798 has been described as a prophetic Rosetta Stone. He's referring here to his own book, which is a pretty famous analysis of the growth of fundamentalism in North America especially. Jean-Francis Champollion, a French scholar following Napoleon in 1799, discovered at the Rosetta mouth of the Nile a text written in Egyptian hieroglyphics, Egyptian Demotic script, and Greek. Champollion had found what we now call the Rosetta Stone, a text in 3 languages which allowed him to decipher the hitherto incomprehensible Egyptian hieroglyphics. Similarly, the news that Napoleon had dethroned the Pope gave Bible scholars a fixed point in the prophetic chronology of Revelation and Daniel. Some of them felt certain that they could now mark their own location in the unfolding prophetic chronology. An event of the magnitude of the French Revolution might well function as one of the checkpoints in God's timetable, they believed. Protestant prophetic scholars had inherited a traditional belief that the end of the dominance of the beast predicted in Revelation and Daniel would be fulfilled by the crippling of the papacy. According to complicated and not entirely lucid methods of exegesis, this catastrophe was expected to befall the Roman pontiff at the end of 1260 years. Interpreting Napoleon's hostility as the deadly wound of Revelation 13:3, 19th century scholars leapt to the conclusion that the Pope's 1260-year hegemony had ended in 1798. The important aspect of this interpretation was not so much the spiritual reinforcement provided by discovering a prophecy fulfilled, but the fact that one could now make a shrewd, and one hoped spirit-directed guess about the next event. If prophecy was a kind of roadmap of the next grand events of God's drama of history, and most scholars treated it so, then the critical problem was to find the spot where the moving finger was writing before it moved on. Thus the French Revolution accelerated millenarian interest in 2 ways. It upset notions of gradual progress and made apocalyptic expectations seem realistic. And it provided some scholars with confidence that they had found out where they were existentially located in their prophetic program and the historical present. Almost immediately after 1798, books began to be published in England and then in America, which initiated a revival of millenarian interest. There were dozens of millenarian books published in the first 30 years of the 19th century. There were millenarian societies founded, such as the Continental Society, established originally to evangelize Europe, but eventually transformed into a society for prophetic analysis. There were millenarian conferences held, millenarian journals founded. In fact, denominations based largely on millenarian issues. The greatest amount of interest centered on the years 1821 through about 1830. During the decade of the 1820s, most British converts to apocalyptic millenarianism were won. They were drawn largely from the Anglican Church in England and from the established Presbyterian Church in Scotland. A convenient summary of the beliefs of these early 19th century millenarians can be found in a 6-point statement published in 1829 as the conclusion of a series of conferences held at the Albury estate of Henry Drummond, a socially prominent millenarian and member of Parliament. Here's the 6 points. First, the dispensation or age will not end insensibly, but cataclysmically in judgment and destruction of the church, in the same manner in which the Jewish dispensation ended. 2. The Jews will be restored to Palestine during the time of judgment. 3. The judgment to come will fall principally upon Christendom. 4. When the judgment is past, the millennium will begin. 5. The second advent of Christ will occur before the millennium. 6. The 1260 years of Daniel 7 and Revelation 13 ought to be measured from the reign of Justinian to the French Revolution. The vials of wrath, that is Revelation 16, are now being poured out, and the second advent is imminent. This doctrinal summary makes it plain that British millenarians believed that the course of history was inevitably downward trending, that the church as a public institution had been judged and found wanting, and that a cataclysm of judgment was imminent. They were clear and obvious exemplars of the theology of apocalypticism, the outlines of which have already been traced. It is also interesting to note that most of the millenarians in Britain at that time expected that the next important events in the prophetic calendar would occur during the years 1843 to 1848. Millenarianism spread to America during these same years. The Continental Society's magazine was published both in London and in Boston. As there was a society for the evangelism of Jews in Europe, so too was there a similar American society for ameliorating the condition of the Jews, founded in 1820 and including no less a member than John Quincy Adams, who was president in the 1820s. By 1840, there had developed in the United States a sizable millenarian party made up principally of Presbyterian and Episcopalian clergy who had read and accepted the views of the British millenarians. This group was relatively small, however, when compared with the total number of Americans of that era who had been converted to millenarian teachings. The vast majority of American millenarians were, of course, followers, disciples, and converts of William Miller. The extent to which William Miller was influenced by British predecessors is almost impossible to determine, but certainly few non-Adventist scholars would contest the general position of Adventist historians that Miller formulated his positions on the return of Christ in 1843 quite independently. Francis D. Nichol asserted that Miller did read George S. Faber, but except for that one author, we know of no other evidence of British influence. Nevertheless, Adventist historians have often been overly defensive and possessive about William Miller. They seem afraid that they might discover that Miller drew extensively upon British sources in formulating his views. They seem determined to champion him as an independent thinker. Of course, Miller was independent, self-educated, and relatively untrained in formal theology. That Miller independently formulated and proclaimed views similar to those accepted by British millenarians does not increase the credibility of those views, however, and it seems ironic to argue for Miller's independence of mind only to demonstrate that he came independently to conclusions virtually identical to the British. It seems preferable to view Miller and his followers as the American representatives of a general millenarian revival. Insofar as Miller's teachings and organization differed from the British, those differences seem characteristic of America itself. The Millerite movement, in contrast to the British, was more popular, more democratic, more a mass movement, and more revivalistic. This style had not caught on in Britain to the extent that it had in America, although the difference is one of degree and not kind. After all, William Miller's disciples did win converts in Britain itself. Furthermore, the Millerite movement tended to be less inhibited, more flamboyant, and more given to extremes, also a characteristic of American society as a whole at that time. Millerite millenarianism, like other fast-growing movement of the time, was also liable to quick collapse. Most of the converts won to the Millerite movement in the period before 1844 dropped away in disillusionment after the failure of his prophecy of the Second Advent in October 1844. Having noted the contrasts, however, it is the similarities that appear more significant. Regardless of whether Miller was stimulated directly by British millenarians, he certainly did not exist outside the perimeter of his culture as a whole. He could not avoid being influenced by the traditions of biblicism, literal interpretation, and general Christian expectations. Both British and American millenarianism sprang up at the same time. William Miller was poring over the prophetic scriptures in upstate New York at precisely the same time that British scholars were poring over the same prophetic scriptures in Britain and coming to nearly the same conclusions. They both seized upon the same texts. They were both interested in the 1260 years, which they dated to the same period. They were both interested in the further prophecy of the 2300 days, which they predicted would come to fruition in 1843 or 1844. The British and American movements were twin revivals of apocalyptic millenarianism. More to come. I'll put in a link to the Watchtower's use of this prophecy from Daniel chapter 8, the 2300 days.